USS Helena was one of the Brooklyn-class light cruisers that formed the initial US Navy response to both the revised conditions of the London Naval Treaty, which created a distinction between 8-inch and 6-inch armed cruisers, as well as the Japanese Navy's declared compliant vessel, the Megami class. She would be the last of this hull type before construction moved on to the Atlanta and Cleveland classes, and there is some argument to be said that CL-49 and CL-50, USS St. Louis and USS Helena respectively, constitute their own subclass, since they had higher power machinery than their predecessors and were also more survivable, this being accomplished by placing the boiler and engine rooms in alternating blocks, instead of the previous arrangement of having all the boiler rooms in one place and then all the engine rooms in another. This latter approach was slightly more efficient in terms of space and weight, but it meant that a single hit could disable the entire ship's power plant. Exploiting the newer machinery allowed a much more survivable layout to be used for minimal changes in overall weight. The other big change, which was something more immediately obvious to the outside observer, was the replacement of the 8 single 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft only guns with the same number of dual-purpose 5-inch 38 guns, except in 4 twin mounts. Over the course of her career, there would be the inevitable increase in anti-aircraft battery, initially from machine guns to 1.1-inch cannon, and then replacing both of those with 20mm Oerlikon and 40mm Bofors guns. Helena herself would be laid down at the end of 1936, launched in August 1938, and commissioned at the end of 1939. After her shakedown cruise, she was allocated to the Pacific Fleet, arriving at Pearl Harbor in October 1940 and taking part in a number of exercises before being slated for a period of refit in dry dock. Since USS Pennsylvania was in said dry dock at the start of December 1941, Helena was given her mooring berth to await the battleship freeing up the space in the dock. She was still there on December the 7th when a large number of unauthorized Japanese aircraft appeared overhead and began their assault. Within minutes, operating to a trained schedule, a Japanese torpedo bomber sent a torpedo streaking towards where the plan said that Pennsylvania should be. The weapon passed right underneath a mine layer that was stationed next to Helena and blew a hole in the cruiser's side. The blast temporarily knocked out power, and the shockwave sprung leaks in the smaller ship, which would eventually capsize. More aircraft came in, but they either realised that the stricken cruiser wasn't in fact a battleship and went off looking for better targets, or else their torpedoes missed. With some power restored, Helena defended herself and other nearby ships with her anti-aircraft guns, scoring a number of kills and, by a combination of luck and disruptive fire, avoiding any further direct hits, although she would suffer some casualties and minor damage from a number of near misses. She was temporarily patched up and sent back to the continental United States for repairs, which allowed her to receive brand new radar and the bulk of her anti-aircraft upgrades right at the start of her wartime career, after which she'd be launched straight into the meat grinder that was the Guadalcanal campaign, albeit that this would initially, at least for her, consist of escort duty, which included picking up survivors from the sinking of USS Wasp, which Helena had been escorting at the time. However, this relatively reactionary duty would come to an end in October when Helena was part of a close escort force under Admiral Scott when the group ran into a force of older Japanese heavy cruisers on a bombardment mission at night. Thanks to her upgraded radar, Helena was able to spot, track, and lock onto the Japanese ships and, unlike the first Battle of Savo Island, got the drop on the Japanese vessels and opened fire, almost literally decapitating the Japanese command structure with her first salvos. With this initial action netting multiple heavy damaging hits to enemy ships, unfortunately a brief interruption caused by Admiral Scott thinking that they might be firing on friendlies allowed some of the targets to slip away, and in some cases later re-engage the US ships. The Japanese Kinugasa especially proving to be quite the thorn in the US Navy's side. Following this encounter, the Battle of Cape Esperance, the Helena saw a busy period of escort and bombardment duties until the next big action, which would find Helena stuck into what is sometimes called the Battle of Guadalcanal, or sometimes the Third Battle of Savo Island. Once again, the US Admiral in command failed to make the best use of the radar he had in his formation, although once again Helena saw the enemy on radar first. This time, the actual battle would start when destroyers from both formations practically ran into one another, and a confused mess of orders devolved into the naval version of a knife fight fought in a locked closet by two honey badgers who'd been roided up on PCP. Helena ended up fighting numerous Japanese destroyers, and then anything it could point a gun at, emerging from over half an hour of almost continuous fire in a haze of gunsmoke and mild confusion, as despite the ferocious damage suffered on both sides, Helena had largely emerged unscathed. More bombardment and attack missions would follow, during which time she would receive VT-fused shells for anti-aircraft guns, which significantly augmented the lethality of her long-range firepower. Her luck would, however, run out in July 1943, when she was part of a force assigned to block a convoy of Japanese destroyers trying to reinforce one of their garrisons. The ambush was successful, but the ship fired so many shells that she rapidly ran out of the flashless charges she'd been using and had to go back to using normal ones, which would have illuminated her somewhat more starkly to the enemy. Whether it was this, luck, or just something else, about 5 minutes into the engagement, Helena was struck by one shallow-running torpedo, followed in quick succession by two deep-running weapons. With impacts all along the side of the ship, Helena broke up and sank pretty quickly. There then followed a prolonged rescue effort, interrupted 3 times later during the night by Japanese destroyers who were poking around trying to find one of their own ships, which they thought had been disabled in the battle, as well as efforts that had to be made later on to save a number of men who'd managed to make their own way to various islands and peninsulas in the darkness and over the next few days. A total story of which really needs its own video at some point. Of the near 1,200 crew, 168 would be lost either in the sinking or in the immediate aftermath thereof, but most of them would survive, a remarkable last act of preservation by the ship itself, as well as an example of significant skill and bravery by the crew.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.